Welcome to the Vancouver Quaker Meeting House. I want to start by acknowledging that we're standing on unceded Coast Salish territory, and very thankful that we're allowed to do that. There's other places that are unceded that are, well, you'll find out a bit more about shortly. I introduced Amos this morning at the church, and then I found out I had some of my facts wrong, so it kind of made me stop and think, what am I going to say this time? Well, I'll start out the same, and I'll see where it goes. As I said this morning, many introductions start out by saying, I first met so-and-so and this and that situation. I don't recall exactly the situation in which I first met Amos. A wonderful activist who has since died, Thomas Sheik, introduced me to a whole slew of his fellow nonviolent activists when I visited and interviewed him in 1984, and I'm pretty sure Amos was among them. However, the visit that I remember, the early visit I remembered the most was when I visited his kibbutz, which is on the agricultural, tree-full west coast of Israel, kibbutz Shvaim, in April of 1986. And it was the trigger for every spring and fall after that, what's called an atypical hay fever. So I have this recurring reminder of Shvaim and my second visit with Amos. Amos, as I said, lives in kibbutz Shvaim. This is where he was born 69 years ago and raised. And despite that, he has maintained his independent thinking, not just about personal things, but about the world, about the region. And unlike his Zionist upbringing, he has evolved to being an anti-Zionist. And even when I had erroneously said that he did not go to the army, he did, but he managed not to be in combat and did all sorts of alternative things that he kind of arranged for himself. And maybe he'll tell you some of that later. And he continues to be an independent thinker. You can see some of his writing on the website of the Palestine-Israel Journal. There's an article on an escalation of nonviolence, which is kind of a novel idea. And he has also now put together a book that's based on the weekly dispatches he's been sending out now for 4 years, is it? 9. Eh? 9 years? Whoa. Called Don't Say We Did Not Know. It's little bits of human rights abuses and so on by the Israeli government against both Palestinians in the occupied territories and inside Israel that don't generally make it to the public consciousness either in Israel or abroad. And you can get it in English and Hebrew. And that's has come out in a book in Hebrew, and we're hoping sometime in the future that it will come out also in English. So, without further ado, as they say, here's Amos.
Thank you very much for receiving me here. And I hope that with the help of the microphone, we will overcome my terrible voice. And we will make it. I want to speak about the minority of the Bedouins in Israel who are living in the southern part of Israel, the Negev, which is a desert. And but before I speak about the Bedouins, I want first to speak about the conflict, because I think that the issue of the Bedouins is a very integral part of the conflict itself. So I think that in order to understand the issue of the Bedouins and the violations of their human rights, in Israel, we first have to explain how I understand the conflict, and I believe that in the context of it, we can have a better understanding of the story of the Bedouins. To my understanding, our conflict is a conflict between two societies, two nations, that one invaded the life territory of the other one, and in historical process are forcing them out of the territory, and those that they cannot force out, they squeeze to minimal territory as possible. Actually, there were some other conflicts like this in the modern history, and the first one of them is the conflict that happened here in America when the white people arrived and started to force out the original people, and those that remained, they squeezed them into a minimal territory. The same was in Australia, the same was in South Africa. I'll give some figures to demonstrate what I'm talking about when I say that this is the kind of conflict. I'll start with the fact that before the Zionist immigration started to the country, more or less in 1882, there were Jews in the country. They've been around 10% of the population. And I believe they had less than 1% of the lands. In the eve of the War of 48, which for us is the independent war, for the Palestinians is the catastrophe, Nakba, what they call. The Jews already were 1/3 of the population in the country, and they had around 7% of the lands only. In the War of 48, of course, the great majority of the Palestinians became refugees. Around 155,000 of them remained in the country and became Israeli citizens. And then after the war, they started a very fast emigrations of Jews into the country and a process of taking over the lands. Today, if I give the figures in Israel without the occupied territories, the Jews are almost 80% of the population. Palestinians are 18% of the population. 2 or 3 other percents are others. The Jews have now 96% of the lands of what Israel is without the occupied territories. Palestinians remain with 3.5% of the lands. In other words, we see this historical process when majority of the original people were forced out, a smaller number remained in the country, and is squeezed to minimal territory as possible. The problem is that this was not ended within the borders of the ceasefire in 49, the end of the War of 48. After the War of 67, when Israel occupied Sinai and Gaza from Egypt, West Bank from Jordan, and the Golan Heights in the north from the Syrians, we started to see the same process happening in the occupied territories. Again, if I will give some figures, you will be bored with these figures. Today, in the West Bank, without East Jerusalem, 57% of the lands are in Jewish hands. There are 370,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank without East Jerusalem, and between 2.5 million Palestinians. In East Jerusalem, Israel and next to East Jerusalem, 29 villages, so it's much bigger than what was East Jerusalem under the rule of Jordan. And around 35% of the lands are in Israeli hands. 220,000 of Israeli settlers live in East Jerusalem, between 380,000 of Palestinians. In the Golan Heights, the majority of the Syrians that were living in the Golan Heights became refugees during the war of '67 and immediately after. More than 100,000 of people became refugees. Today, there are around 18,000 of Israeli settlers in the Golan Heights, 24,000 of Syrians, and around 80% of the lands are in Israeli hands already. So we see that the whole conflict, the whole process, historical process of invading the territory, the land, and force out the locals and those who and take over the lands and squeeze to minimum possible those who remain in the country. I like to speak about few issues that come out that are very important to understand in respect of this kind of a conflict. One of them is the issue of human rights. Human rights. I believe that in our conflict, the most of the violations of human rights are not done because somebody is a psychopath who enjoys to bother people. I believe they are done in order to achieve ideological political aims. If you want to take over the land, if you force people out of their lands, you violate their human rights, you try to force them out, you destroy houses, you violate human rights, etc. But the same activities we have to see in another respect. There is very different understanding between the sides the word war. W-A-R, yes? War. Very different understanding between the two sides. For the Israelis, war is the violent clash between the two sides. I'm afraid for the most of the Western people, this is how people understand war. For the Palestinian, the story is wider than that. Land confiscation for the Israelis is a bureaucratic act that you do according to the law. You need the land for military, for security need, for public need, whatever needs, you can confiscate them. It's illegal. It's according with the law. For Palestinians, it is a one-sided act of war that is done by military force against defenseless civilians. House demolition, it's a very visual and very traumatic event. They first stuck the house demolition order on the door or near the door. Entire family come into panic, what will happen with them? And when the terrible day come, the army unit comes, surround the house, force the people out, and destroy it in front of their eyes. It's a very traumatic event. And again, for the Israelis, it is enforcement of the law. For the Palestinians, it is one-sided act of war, of military force against defenseless people. Building settlement, for Israelis, it's a pioneering. For Palestinians, is also one-sided act of war, of military force against defenseless civilians, because this always it's on stolen land, and then it is based to expand them. Always there are security need of the settlers, which demands to expand the territory of the settlement. Around 80% of the water of the West Bank, Israel take for only Jewish use only. Again, for Israelis, it is, I don't know what. For Palestinians, it is one-sided act of war, of military power, force against defenseless civilians. I will not continue with this list, it's too long, but I will say something that might surprise some of you. All of these activities that I spoke about now have nothing to do with our security. Land confiscation have nothing to do with our security. House demolition have nothing to do with our security. Building settlements have nothing to do with our security. Stealing the water have nothing to do with our security. But it is enough that tiny percent of Palestinians that pass the traumas that these activities have given to them will decide to take revenge, and you have the whole army of terrorists that attack us in revenge to what the Israeli army have done to them. And here starts the security job of the Israeli army, to defend from the Palestinian resistance of taking their lands under their feet. In other words, these all activities are about expanding the Israeli territory in the respect of the whole process that I'm speaking about, of that one society invade the life territory of another society, and in historical process force them out of the territory, or squeeze the rest of them to minimal as possible. Why I'm speaking about it? Because if you don't understand the differences of understanding war between the sides, sometimes you don't understand the issue. We had Oslo Agreement and Oslo process, which created enormous optimism. When Oslo Agreement was signed, you don't know what kind of optimism was in the air. People told me in my kibbutz, finish, now you don't have what to do with yourself. There is peace, nothing. I was laughing that I will go back to play chess. I think that the Palestinians quite quickly wake up from this optimism. For the Israelis, it took a longer time. But what happened in Oslo process, in the 7 years between the signing of Oslo Agreement to the breaking of the Second Intifada? During those 7 years, Israel demolished around 1,000 of Palestinian homes. There is one estimation that says that during those 7 years, Israel confiscated around 40,000 of dunams from Palestinians. During those 7 years, there were 2 deportations of Palestinians from their homes and from their land. During those 7 years, the number of settlers in the West Bank without East Jerusalem was growing from 110,000 Israeli settlers in 1993 to 204,000 in 2000 when the Second Intifada broke out. In other words, during those 7 years that we had the illusion that we are in a peace process, on the ground there was a one-sided war that was not stopping for any moment. And therefore, people were surprised why it happened. And they were surprised because our media understand the war in the Israeli way. They did not inform us about the house demolition, the land confiscation, the expansion of the settlements. They did not tell us. So people did not understand why this crazy Palestinian suddenly, out of a peace process, start to fight. But now the issue is more than that. Israel have a serious problem. After the war of 67, by the way, it was labor government, they decided to expand the Israeli territory, to start steps in order to annex to Israel at least part of the territories, if not all. Now, they had a very serious problem. All the Israeli supporters oppose it. United States oppose it. I believe Canada, maybe not this present Prime Minister. Europe oppose it. How you do something that all of your supporters, that your existence depends on them, oppose? You do it slowly. You confiscate that size of land that will not create protest. You demolish homes, that number that will not cause protest. You build a settlement slowly that it will not cause protest. Now, but there is another thing. All of those one-sided acts of war that I'm talking about there is not bloodshed. Not bloodshed. And if there is not bloodshed, the media is not reporting. It's a problem. We in the peace movement, when we ask the media, where are you? Why don't you report? They are telling us, whenever there will be blood, call us, we will come. So, and if the media is not reporting, nobody knows and nobody protests. And this is how you do a policy that your supporters oppose in order not to lose their support. And now I want to turn to the Bedouins. There is a big disagreement over the issues about the Bedouins. First, how many Bedouins were in the Negev, in the south, what it is now the south of Israel, in the eve of 48? Here, okay, later I will speak about this. The minimalists say there were only 65,000 of Bedouins. The maximalists say there were 110,000 of Bedouins in the Negev. Then there is a question, how much land Bedouins were intensively cultivated? The minimalists speak about 400,000 of acres. The maximalists speak about 850,000 of acres. So there is a huge disagreement about this, how much, you know. What we don't know is that, first of all, like the rest of the Palestinians, most of the Bedouins became refugees during the War of 48. But what is not known is that 10 years after the ceasefire agreement was done, 1949, 10 years after, Israel still kicked out Bedouins out of the country. In other words, Bedouins were forced out, not in the context of the war, of the declared war. It was a war, but not a declared one. Now, Bedouins lived all over the Negev, the southern part. It's all desert. Before 48, here you have a map. Here it's traditional tribal. I have a problem because in each tribe like this, there were some different tribes. So I call them nations, Bedouin nations, okay? Here you have the Hebrew and English names of the different tribes and their territory. It's a schematic map, yes, that shows what nations and where they were settled. Here is Beersheba, here is Dimona, and here is the border with the West Bank. Can you change the map, please? Aside of forcing, during the 50s, aside of forcing Bedouin out of the country, there was a policy to concentrate the all remaining Bedouins into this area called Sayag Zone. Now, in the Sayag Zone, most of the Bedouins that are living in Sayag Zone were there before. So they usually kicked out from the country more from these areas. Here is Gaza Strip, very fertile agricultural lands, or from the rest of the Negev, and to the Sayag Zone. The technique was that, first of all, like all the Palestinians in the country, also the Bedouins were under military governing. Since the independence of Israel until 1966, all the Palestinian citizens of Israel were under military governing. So the Bedouins too. The story used to be that a military governor used to come to a sheikh, the leader of a tribe, telling him that the army is going to make maneuvers in their area, and for their security, they will move away. After half a year, when the maneuvers will be over, they will be able to go back. They never been allowed back, and the lands have been taken, and they were done the necessary laws to do it, to legalize it. But this was not the end of the story. In the 60s, they started a new policy. Now, they want to concentrate all the Bedouins into towns. Bedouins in the Negev and have only the option of living in towns. Otherwise, they break the Israeli law. In order to convince them to go to the towns, they did not recognize the villages. Bedouin villages that have been here before the establishment of Israel were not recognized. Bedouins villages that the state create by removing them from their land into this area did not get legal status, and now the government say to them that they are invaders. They invade the state land. Now, to be unrecognized village means that you don't appear on the official maps of the country. It means that you cannot build your homes legal. So if a Bedouin wants to exercise his very basic human rights of having shelter over his head in the villages, he breaks the Israeli law. There is estimation that says that around 50,000 Bedouin houses are illegally built in the villages. Now, unrecognized village cannot have a municipal council. So no municipal services. No electricity, no running water, no roads, not anything. But this is not enough, because Bedouins does not leave their villages. So, since they build illegally, they demolish homes. In 2011, the Israeli government demolished around 1,000 Bedouin houses in the Negev. To my knowledge, there was not one item on it in the Hebrew media. In other words, for the normal Israeli citizens, it is something that never happened. They don't know of it. It is something that not happening. Now I believe it is more or less 850 houses a year that are demolished. By the way, a lot of them demolished by their owners under the threat that if they will not demolish, the state will demolish and they will have to pay for it. But this is not enough. They also demolish villages. Now we are fighting over a village called El Arakiv, which was already demolished 83 times. And on the other side of the road, there was another village that we were fought with them before, while Abu Jarawal, which was after 50 demolitions and some arrests, gave up. And now, instead of the village, there is a forest that the Jewish National Fund was planting. El Arakiv, that I'm speaking about, there is a little bit a mixture in it, because there is the small El Arakiv village, and there is El Arakiv area. El Arakiv area is something like 30,000 dunams. 30,000 dunams, yeah, something like that. Somewhere here. Beersheba, yeah, somewhere here. There were some tribes in El Arakiv. Most of them were forced out in the early 50s. The government never, the most of the land the government never had any use. So in a normal country, when you confiscate land, if you don't use it for what you confiscated it, after a reasonable time, you give it back. Here, instead of giving it back, they rent the lands to the Jewish National Fund, ask them to plant forest. So they've planted forests that call ambassadors for forests, and with the endorsement of some ambassadors who did not have an idea what they are supporting. And actually, it is to put forest in order to prove use and not to give it back to the owners. Now, the story with the village El Arakib is that when this forest came few hundred meters towards the village, the state started to demolish the entire village. The first demolition was in the 27th of July, 2010. And since then, as I said, 83 times the village was demolished. And since these stubborn people don't understand the hint, they started to make a campaign of suing them in the courts. One of the appeals to the court is that they have to pay for the demolitions of their village so many times, 1,800,000 of shekels. You know, this is a kind of service that the government give, but cannot pay it by itself, and you have to pay to the government that they destroy your life. And now they got another sue that the 10 of them who remain in the village, not everyone remain in the village, have to pay 5,000 shekels for every day since the 26th of February. Probably there was kind of a decision of court. The state claimed that the decision was that they have to leave the place. And so since they did not leave, they have to pay to the state or to the court 5,000 shekels a day since 26th of February. In other words, if they are so stubborn not to leave their lands, they will break them by the finance pressure. And we, some human rights activists, are standing in support of them for some good years now. And with a big problem, because the sheikh of the village, Sheikh Sayach, whenever I bring groups to visit there, he is willing to show the document that his grandfather bought the land in 1905 from somebody from a Lokbi tribe. And then he tells us that in 1914 they started the graveyard of the village, which is until today active. And then he showed us documents of paying taxes, I think to the British mandate. Still, for the Israelis, this is not enough. And there is the story about the lands. Actually, all the story is about the lands. The Ottoman Empire made a law of lands in 1858, which demanded that everyone who has a land have to register his land according to this Ottoman law. Now, the Ottomans did this law because they wanted to take taxes. Almost all the Bedouins refused to register. I'm afraid that a huge number, or even maybe the most, of the Palestinians refused to register their lands according to the Ottoman law, because the traditional law was good enough for them. Now, the Zionist movement, when they wanted to start kibbutzim in the Negev, before 48, before the independence, they used to buy lands from Bedouins, according to the traditional way. Now, after Israel became independent, Israel say, sorry, we don't recognize a traditional ownership, but only the Ottoman registrations. So, Sheikh Sayah can come with his document, but they created a situation, legal situation, that it will not be recognized. In the early 70s, the Israeli government allowed Bedouins to register their lands, to make their claims over their lands. And around 3,000 or 3,200 of Bedouins made the claims over their lands. The state froze the issue for 30 years. After 30 years, they started to appeal to the Israeli court a counterclaim. The state come to the court and say, here and here, this man demanded that this piece of land is his. We say that this is state land, not his. Now, in all the cases that until today have been in the court, the state win. Very, very simple. But there is a small problem, very small problem. And the problem is that actually the robber of the land made laws that legalize the robbing of the land. And now the courts are ruling according to those laws. So yes, we are a democratic state. Every Bedouin can go to the court and demand his right over his land. But until today, always they lose. Why? Because the robber made the laws that legalize his activities, and he bring his judges to decide. You and me are fighting over a land. I make the law. I bring the judge. And you have, you can appeal to the court, but you don't have chance. And this is the story. This is the story, and therefore I speak about the clash between law and morality. I promise you that if somebody will bring a suggestion to the Israeli parliament, Knesset we call it, that robbery is okay, I promise you the whole 120 parliament members, whether they are from the left or from the right, will vote against it. They will not accept a law which stands clearly against morality. They will not. But here it is, we have a set of laws about land that if you examine them very careful, you will realize that these are laws of robbery. Just that they were formulated in universal language. In none of them is written to take land from Arab to Jews. No one of them. It is enough that it is say that if nobody was using that land in certain year, it's become automatic state land. Now, people were forced out of their houses, from their lands, and then the period of time that specific laws speak about, nobody used the land, so the land became automatically state land. Is it written that it was taken from Arabs to Jews? Forget it. We don't do such racist laws. So we have a very serious problem between law and morality. Also creating a situation that entire society build their homes illegally. Every Bedouin baby that come from the hospital of Beersheba after the birth to home in the village is breaking the Israeli law before he has a conscience. This is, yes, it is a law. But when entire society is breaking the law, the problem is not with the society, the problem is with the law. Always we have a percentage in societies of people who break the law, always. But when the entire society break the law, the problem is with the law, not with the society. And this is the case. This is the case. Now, I am a Jewish. What can I do? I born in Israel, I grown up there. When I studied in the school, history, it was divided. There was general history and there was a Jewish history. And I was not good student for history. I was not good. And I don't have good memory, but one thing I will remember always. Along all of this bloody Jewish history, people were persecuted because of one crime. Not because they did something wrong, but because they were Jews. And here, in a Jewish state, people are persecuted not because they did something wrong, but because they dared to be born Bedouins in the Jewish state. And out of our history, I cannot tolerate it. And out of our history, I cannot tolerate that Israel made a specific police unit to persecute Bedouins in the Negev. It's called Yechidat Yoav, Yoav unit, specifically for protecting the house demolition. They destroy crops of wheat and barley. They destroy the entire villages. And remember, this is the Jewish state, people who always been persecuted along of this bloody history. And when it is come that we have the power, we are not better. And we should not tolerate it. Thank you.